Good morning. I'm happy to see everyone here with us this morning. I'm hoping my voice is coming through loud and clear. We're having a little bit of a lag this morning. I welcome you, and I welcome you to the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I'm happy to see our regular members as well as some visitors today. Judy Stock, I'm happy you found us. Thank you for joining us this morning. Just a little bit about us. We are an open and a lay-led congregation. We welcome all of our regulars and all of our visitors. We base a lot of what we do and say and how we live on our 8 principles. And we find that those give us what we need to direct us. So we're happy to have you with us today. We have a fabulous speaker today, although like Ted said, he's going to turn it over to us today. Ted is going to lead a discussion this morning on race relations. Ted is a former member of our fellowship and a frequent speaker, often on environmental topics, and we are looking forward to how he can share with us this morning and help us along the way toward that 8th principle. So we welcome you. Our theme for the month of April for the UU fellowships around the world is becoming. So stop and think about that word a minute, becoming. What are we becoming? Are we becoming more caring? Are we becoming people willing to do the work? Are we becoming more aware of what's going on in our world? Are we becoming brave? Are we becoming more social after a year of being isolated from each other? Are we becoming more whole? Listen for those words in our opening words today. Are we becoming a good ancestor? The way we read about in Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. So we will keep that theme of becoming on our mind. And now, are there any announcements this morning? If so, show me and unmute yourself by pressing on your space bar. Jim?
This is a follow-up to our Me and White Supremacy book group. Last Wednesday, people who read Me and White Supremacy and the New Jim Crow gathered together for a follow-up discussion. And at that discussion, we decided to read a next book, which is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And what I'm asking for, Mary Jo and I led the last book discussion, and we're looking for 2 co-leaders who want to step up to lead the next discussion on caste. So looking for 2 volunteers. You can contact me and we can kind of give you the background on what you need to do to facilitate a book discussion. So as a lay-led congregation, we all kind of have to pitch in. So looking for volunteers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
I have
Bev.
I just wanted to ask Judy Stock if she would write her email or phone number in the chat box. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Kathy?
We have a couple more months, the end of April and into May, and then we would begin our summer session. And you know, in the past, we usually have members of our own congregation participate more fully by being the presenters during the summer months. So we'll be sending out a notice shortly, but keep in mind that we all enjoy hearing from each one of you. So think about whether or not you're willing to participate and share with us for 15, 20 minutes during the summer. We'll send out a formal notice shortly.
Kathy, can you mention what the theme is for this summer?
Well, we're going to mention that in the discussion or in the email.
Any other announcements today? Thank you all, and we will go into our chalice lighting. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, a sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. And our opening words today are Amid the Noise of Our Lives by Tim Haley, and Dick will read those for us.
Amid all the noise in our lives, we take this moment to sit in silence, to give thanks for another day, to give thanks for all those in our lives who have brought us warmth and love, and to give thanks for the gift of life. We know we are on a pilgrimage here, but a brief moment of time. Let us open ourselves here now to the process of becoming more whole, of living more fully, of giving and forgiving more freely, of understanding more completely the meaning of our lives here on this earth.
And our opening hymn today is from our hymnal, number 95, There is More Love Somewhere.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more hope somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more peace somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more joy somewhere.
At this time, rather than having a presentation by Ted, he will lead us in a discussion on the topic, I'm not colorblind, are you? And Ted did present this to his Northwoods Fellowship. And what Ted will do is lead us in some questions and give us some anecdotal stories about himself. And then if you have a response or a comment or a feeling about the question, we would really love to hear from you. At which time, feel free again to unmute yourself and join in the discussion. So Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary Jo. As the trial of over George Floyd deaths wears on, and for multiple other reasons, it's appropriate to have a discussion about attitudes toward race. And since I don't feel qualified to preach on the topic, I decided to lead a discussion instead. So I'll be sharing some anecdotes from my life and my experiences and ask you to share yours if you want to. And I hope you will, because if you don't, this is going to be a really short service. So I call this discussion, I am not colorblind, because I believe the concept of a colorblind society is somewhat misguided. We should be colorblind in that no one gets denied an opportunity, a job, or whatever because of skin color. But that aside, differences between the races are to be noticed and celebrated and not overlooked. Diversity makes us better people and a better society. So with that, let's examine a few questions. Be aware that in the interest of finishing on time, we might need to cut off discussion on a given topic, even if some people still have thoughts to offer. So the first question is, what were your experiences with race growing up in your home and neighborhood? I, of course, grew up in Two Rivers, and although there were no black people to be seen in Two Rivers back then, there was the N word was a common part of the vernacular around the neighborhood kids. If you wanted to insult someone, you'd call them the N word. The choosing rhyme was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an N word by the toe. And the big Brazil nuts that we get at Christmas were N word toes, and the little licorice babies were N word babies. And my brothers and sisters and I, hearing that around town, around the neighborhood, was just freely spoken. My mother would have none of it. I mean, that kind of language was verboten around our house, thankfully. And I wonder how I would have ended up without that kind of guidance. So my question to you is, what were your experiences with race growing up in your home and neighborhood? And Mary Jo will call on people who raise their hand.
Linda?
I grew up in a neighborhood that actually had not only one black family, but an entire black church, a small church, but nevertheless a church. Happily, those terms that you used, that you mentioned, Ted, were not so happily, were not unfamiliar to me either, but I didn't hear them in my home either. I didn't also hear a negative about it. The only negative I ever heard about blacks was my mother saying when they moved to Detroit, they pushed her off the sidewalk. And she made no further comment about it. That was it. I should mention this was in 1940, and the African Americans had just moved into Detroit for jobs, and there were no houses for them. So it was not a happy time in Detroit. Judy Stock has her hand up.
Judy?
Need to unmute yourself, Judy. Okay.
Yep. I just realized. I grew up on a farm in Newton, and again, the N-word was used freely. I never met a black person until, and I have this vague memory that we went to the Milwaukee Zoo. My parents took us there. We didn't go a whole lot out of, Manitowoc County. And I remember my mom fussing at us, or actually, scolding us because we were staring at all the black people because we had never seen them before. And so I just have that memory. And, and again, the word was used all the time in my house. And even, unfortunately, up to the time my parents passed, my mother not so much, but my dad, it would come out. So that's all.
I got one.
Dick?
I got one. My dad in the Holsting ran a restaurant tavern, and the Holsting had sundown laws, and it was a Sunday afternoon after a Packer game, and two Packer defensive linemen stopped in for supper. And all of a sudden, all of the racism in that tavern and in that community just went away just like that. It was very awkward for my dad, who was very racist, but being a Packer made up for the difference.
Kim.
Yeah, I have an interesting perspective. Growing up in Chicago, obviously, Black people and Hispanic people and so on. And being of Polish descent, there is a large Polish population in Chicago. And the round of Polish jokes, which I'm sure you all experienced at one point or another. At one point, we were down at the Museum of Science and Industry as a family, which we've often gone to visit. But my brother, who may have been 8 or so, connected the increase in Black population that he was seeing to Polish people. And he says in the car, "Daddy, look at all the Black Polish people." Which, isn't that interesting? So, and my father said, "Well, they're not Polish, they're just Black." And of course, there was really no racism in our family either. The N word, we probably would have been smacked across the room by my mother had we even uttered it. Except that there was some racism in the extended family, so we would occasionally hear it, and my mom would gently try to correct that. But as Ted pointed out, in Chicago, Brazil nuts were also labeled as N-toes, which is quite interesting. But it's funny that my brother hearing, I always wonder, did he see something derogatory using, look at all the Polish Blacks, or the Black Polacks, I think is what he said. Is it because he heard such negativity on Polacks and he labeled African Americans that way as well, or just a weird coincidence from a 7-year-old? So, but it's a funny story, and it's a really interesting, yeah.
This is Jim. I grew up with in Chicago in a Irish Jewish neighborhood. So my first dealing with differences was with my Jewish friends that I tried to save throughout my grade school endeavor. But the north side of Chicago was pretty integrated. Wrigley Park was really where I had my real first introduction to people of color, and it was kind of a curious other, and yet we shared the same interest in the sports, whether it was baseball or football at Wrigley Park. And then obviously also riding the L was always an experience. But what really changed it for me was I went to Missouri, my oldest sister and I, when I was 12, and Mary was 11. We went on the train to Missouri to visit my cousins, and we went unaccompanied. And there was a Black porter on the train who kind of took care of us on that trip. And that was my real kind of breakthrough in terms of really connecting with someone of color, who it was just as he, checked in on us all throughout that trip. It was a really neat experience.
Mary Jo, maybe we should move on to the next question.
I think so. Thank you for the comments we've heard thus far. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, so the next question has to do with race experiences in a community. When I was in late high school in Two Rivers, there was a fair housing ordinance on the city council agenda. My father was an outspoken advocate for it, as were the priests and nuns and many others from my Catholic parish. The ordinance got approved, but not without a lot of heated debate. There was the opponents, basically their claim was, we have nothing against black people. We just think that if you're a landlord, you should get to decide who you can and can't rent to. And I was gone from Two Rivers before the Hmong people started getting resettled here, there, and I imagine that was pretty difficult in various ways. So, what's your experience with turmoil over race in your community where you grew up?
Ted, I grew up in a very white community, Sussex, a suburb of Milwaukee, so I was close to turmoil, but not directly in it during the 60s. But I went to school in Oshkosh, and there was a contingency of Black students who felt that their race was not represented by the professors at the university. And so they took over the office of the president of the university. And it got pretty wild. And what happened was they ended up shutting down school. It was close to Thanksgiving break, but it was like a week prior. And they closed the school down to try to cool down the climate of what was going on. And that was my first experience with racial issues that could turn difficult and challenging. And it was of a lot of interest to me. And later that summer, when I was home, Milwaukee had nights and nights of burning, and after the Martin Luther King assassination. So I was made keenly aware of racial issues a little bit outside of my own kin. Benita.
Let me unmute here. I think the most the incident that was the most turning point for me, because I did grow up in a tavern in Francis Creek, and my dad being pure Polish, the Polish jokes, but also lots of racist and bigoted jokes, and it was just rampant. And I proudly told those jokes, for a long, long time. And when I went to school in Milwaukee in 73, 74, I was just fascinated by, friends. I had a Black roommate, and it was a completely unknown entity to me, as far as, learning about the culture. I was invited to home parties, and I loved music, so I would go to clubs where sometimes I was the only white person there. But the most interesting experience I had was I joined Students for a Democratic Society, and in Milwaukee, and things were developing with the group in a violent way, which frightened me terribly. But I think what was even more frightening to me was my not able to grasp or understand what that was all about. So I was swept up in that, wanting to be part of it, but not really understanding the core of it and the experience of it. So, but that was a beginning foray.
Thank you, Benita. Sandy?
I need to push my bar down. In about the mid 60s, before I went to school, I worked in downtown Milwaukee at the Veterans Administration, and that was really my first introduction to Black people because I grew up in basically a white community in Waukesha area. And at lunchtime, we would go out for and try and get served for lunch in the various eateries off of Water Street. And rarely would that happen. In fact, in one instance, we went to the place called Someplace Else, and it was a very popular bar restaurant, and they brought out the black dogs to chase us away. And so I guess that was really the beginning of my awakening and it also was a time in my life where I met some wonderful people.
Carolyn?
Oh, hi. I grew up
Hi.
in Mason City, Iowa, and it'd be similar to Manitowoc. And our high school was about the same size as Lincoln, and there were two Black girls in my class, and they were both good students. And one of them, I think, stopped. She got into a real argument, even a really strong argument with a gym teacher, and accused her of being racist. And I don't remember what it was, what her issue was, but she was really good at making her point. And then she went on and got a doctorate degree later on, in life. That's my experience in that realm.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, should we move on?
Sure.
Okay. The next question has to do with friends of color that we might have had in our life. While I was in college, I had a good friend, Wes. I met him during my sophomore year, and we would party together, spend time in each other's rooms, do things together off campus. It wasn't like I hung out with him exclusively, but he was in my circle. When a hometown friend and I took a hitchhiking trip down south, we ended up staying overnight at Wes's house in North Carolina. He lived in Charlotte. So Wes was, it was in the relationship, it was very clear that Wes was Black and I was white. It was not a colorblind friendship whatsoever. Wes was, if you picture the character of Rod Tidwell in the movie Jerry Maguire, that was kind of Wes, brash, outspoken, rarely had a thought come into his head that didn't come out his mouth. But, we had a good time together. One time we were in Wes's dorm room and he started talking about this Isley Brothers album that he wanted me to hear. And I said, gee, I don't know much about the Isley Brothers. And he said, yeah, I know, they're Black. And I said, well, screw you, Wes. And he said, you mean to tell me that you spend a lot of time listening to Black music? And I said, well, no. And Wes said, well, all right then. So that was Wes. But anyway, we liked and respected each other and had a lot of good times together. So have you had a friend of color? Have you or do you have? And how did race influence the relationship?
Jeanette.
As many of you know, I have two African-American sons who we adopted, and my husband and I met when we were living in China. He is a white California boy, but so we met and got to know each other in a completely different culture, but we agreed on the idea of adoption from the get-go, and race really, we kind of went into it as being colorblind about race. However, the further we got along in the process, the more we wanted to adopt either a Chinese girl or African-American boys for a variety of reasons. And we decided to adopt an African-American sibling group. and part of it was we both had friends of different cultures. I had dated two African American men prior to that, and so to me, I felt like we were fairly prepared. Fortunately, Mike worked in Madison and was part of the Kraft Foods African American Council. And through that, we developed some really fantastic friendships who I don't know what we would have done in supporting our boys in their, especially in the early years that they were with us, without that support of the African American Council at Kraft Foods. And Mike has been working on developing something along those lines at Johnsonville. So that's kind of the nutshell. There's a lot more, but.
Thank you, Jeanette. That's so interesting. Other, Kathy?
Yeah, this is Kathy, yeah. And as most of you know, Joe and I got a real surprise when our son said he's going to send us a picture of, our son is a teacher, lives in the Houston area. He's gonna send us a picture of this girl he's dating. He'd like us to come down and meet her. And so our surprise was she was a Black girl. So we went down and met her, and a pleasant young lady, very, very immature, but very pleasant. And that provided us the opportunity to re-examine our opinions about Black people and being close to Black people and living with Black people. You know, it was eye-opening because we always told the kids, everyone's the same inside. Everyone's the same inside. Everyone should be respected and cared for and taken care of, and, you know, treat all people equally. But all of a sudden we're faced with doing it. And it was interesting. And I'm so glad we've had this experience. That marriage did not last. That immaturity thing sort of ruined it. But now he has a new wife, LaToya, and she comes with a couple of children of her own, and they have a child together, and Joe has, so we have, for all practical purposes, 5 grandchildren of color, various shades of color. And they were just up here. I'll just tell you one little story. They were just up here in March, and Joe and LaToya and my husband Joe and I were in the living room talking, and all of a sudden LaToya started talking about how her children, how their children will do in life. And it made me sad because her son and daughter are very dark. Their father was Black, and they have the typical Black hair and features. And Joe's daughters are a blend, and their hair is more manageable, and they're lighter skinned. And the child they have together, you'd have to look twice to decide, is she Black or white? But LaToya was just talking about how much harder it will be for Travion and Brianna in life to get along than it will be, because Cyan will probably pass easily. And she was still using those words, pass. And maybe Aurora's personality will carry her through, you know, but I felt very sad because I know she's right. There's still going to be a struggle for the darker skinned children, but what a thing to have to think about as a mother. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Kathy. Other comments on?
Jim Rabata?
I have one, Judy.
Okay, Judy?
I never had a friend, even though I lived in New Orleans for 13 years. I mean, I had acquaintances who were Black, but when I moved to Ithaca, actually about 3 years ago, when I was living there, I was asked to help out a woman who is a member of the Unitarian Church, and she needed some assistance in downsizing in her home and other things. And we ended up becoming very good friends. And her name was Dorothy Cotton. She was Martin Luther King's education director. She was part of his team. And when they asked me to work with this woman, I was like, are you serious? I mean, this woman changed my life in so many ways. I spent the last 2 years of her life with her, after working with her and, downsizing her home and getting her into a different living space where she could get more assistance. She had no children. So had nieces and nephews, and but that was, her family, and they all didn't live close at all. So I was her personal assistant. She was still at the time taking an occasional, speaking job, but she was at the point where she couldn't handle that stuff on her own, but was too proud to ask for help. So I sort of just slid in there and was her friend, her confidant, and then we sang together, which was, oh my gosh, just the most amazing experience I've ever had. So I could go on and on about stories about Dorothy, but again, it was just, and the race relations, I shared some of my childhood things, about the Brazil nuts and about this and that. And then she shared some really hard stories with me. And it was just, yeah, if I could get her to really talk about her experiences, that was some of the best times. But she'd rather sing, so, than do that. So anyway, I'd be happy to talk to y'all about it at some point. That's all.
Okay, we should
Incredible story, Judy. Thank you.
Very quickly, Ted, I've got
Okay.
explain that piece of artwork behind us. This was done by Lev Mills, a fellow that we met in graduate school in Madison. Yeah, we lived in Mary Dorm at the same time with them, and we became good friends. And this is something we purchased from him at that time. He has since become a professor of art in Alabama somewhere. We haven't kept in contact, but I thought you'd be interested in that.
Thank you. Okay, we should move on. The next question is about the experience of being the only white person in a room. When I was in college, my junior year, the college opened up a center for Black students called Matthews Center, and the Black students became kind of insular. There was, I would almost say, militant, and there was some resentment among the white population. I would call it under the surface racial tension. There weren't any quarrels or outbursts or anything like that, just a lot of unspoken suspicion. And one evening, my friend Wes told me he was going to visit someone at Matthews Center and asked me to come along. So I went inside and I sat down in the lounge, and he went up to stairs to visit his friend. And I sat in this room, in this all black dorm center, whatever you want to call it, just absolutely terrified. And people would walk by, and I just sat on the couch and didn't say anything. I don't know why I had to be so afraid, because I was, these were just other students. I could have at least said hello, but that's how I was. I'm not proud of, of the way that went, but that's how I was at the time. In a room full of people. And what was that like for you?
Hello.
Hang on.
In about around 1967, we lived in Washington, D.C. It was just after Tent City, and Washington had its share of burning. And I worked downtown in D.C., and each morning I would have to get on the bus, and I would be the only white person on the bus. And I could just feel the hate when I got on that bus. And the Black people on the bus made sure I never got a seat. And all the time, in my very naive Wisconsin thinking. I'm saying to myself, I didn't do this. This isn't my fault. So that was my experience.
Dick?
In the service, when I was in Vietnam, and we would be in a civilized area like a mess hall, which was actually rare, but there was always a noticeable segregation between black and white people when it came to seating. But the most interesting segregation was between northern blacks and southern blacks. And the northern blacks wanted nothing to do with anybody of color from the south because they thought those guys were inferior to the northern black, who they thought were more acquainted with knowledge and education. And so the segregation between those two separate groups of Afro Americans I found very, very peculiar and interesting.
Benita?
I shared earlier going to school in Milwaukee, and my roommate at St. Kate's dorm, St. Catherine's dorm for women, was a wonderful Black woman. I had no experience with getting to know, you know, Black people, as growing up and the experiences. So Regina, I shared that she took me to her home. I met all of her brothers and went to family gatherings and such, and then went to the jazz clubs and such. So I felt this sense of privilege, being the only white person, you know, with their family gatherings and at these clubs. So then when I decided that I wanted to get more involved in the cause, so to speak, with the Students for a Democratic Society, and it was in the news, things were turning violent in you know, very destructive ways, actually. I was so confused because I thought that my welcome with Regina's family, then when I was in the meetings with, I mean, literally pushed around and disrespected and disregarded. I mean, we had done, you know, that as white people, we had been disrespectful and disregarded. So I was getting a taste of that in the meetings. So that was a very, very confusing and just bewildering time for me. And I really didn't sort that out. In fact, I think I'm still sorting it out, but I didn't sort it out for decades, truly.
Chris and Jenny?
Yeah, hi. So I've, you know, thinking about all the times, I've actually had a lot of situations where I've been in rooms full of Black people and being the only white person. But one of the most significant situations I've been in was when I went with my dad to Zimbabwe. One of my sisters was living there at the time, and she was there just after Zimbabwe had gained its independence. And so when we showed up there, it was in a time of transition where all of the old colonialist practices and attitudes were still in place, but or a lot of them were anyways. But you could tell that the Black Zimbabweans were gaining their confidence and gaining a sense of freedom and of power, I guess you would say. So what was really interesting about it was coming from a country in which the dominant culture, the dominant race is subverting and oppressing a minority population is an understandable experience, or a more understandable experience. You can see how that can easily happen. But to be in a country in which the minority population was dominating the majority population was just a whole different thing. And it really helped me understand the degree of oppression and abuse and brutality that it must have taken to keep an entire population, a majority population, an entire country full of people of an opposite persuasion, whether that's racial or religious or whatever. It just really made me aware of the degree of brutality that it had been imposed on those people during their times of colonization. And it just put a whole different spin on the whole thing for me.
So Mary Jo, we're bumping up against our end time here. How do you want to go forward?
Should we take one more question? And Ted, you choose which one you think. I just am appreciative of how much we have to share with each other. Let's take one more, Ted.
Okay. So this one is about racism in the workplace. I used to work for a Milwaukee area advertising agency, and all 100 of us who worked there were white. And I was involved in some hiring decisions. And once I asked my boss if we might consider hiring a black account executive, and his answer was, no, our clients would never accept them. So what that meant was that if a resume came in from someone named Jamal or Latanya, it would probably get summarily tossed. I was stunned, and I wanted to reply, that says more about you and about us than about our clients. But not being in a position of power, I kept quiet. I'm not exactly proud of that either. But how about you? Have you ever seen overt racism in the workplace?
This is Bev.
Okay, Bev.
Okay, I worked in a hospital in Sheboygan for many years, and I remember when the Hmong people came into our community, and since I was working in pediatrics, we had a lot of them that were patients, and I was so impressed with the families, how they came in and took care of their family, the babies, and I mean, the whole family would be there. And then, but it was, it was really difficult to deal with, and like the rest of you have said, I wish I would have spoken up more. Other comments that you heard about these people that came over here from the Vietnam War, it was just, I, I don't know, the other community and that I would hear words about were the Hispanic community were called Mexicans, and that negative tone of voice. It's just so amazing how many of us here today have had these experiences. And I think it would have been more helpful if we would have talked about this garbage years ago, so we could have all been more awake. I mean, I guess I never thought about even doing that, but I'm grateful that we are talking about it now.
Such an important comment, Bev. I agree. Why didn't we speak up? I don't know.
This is Jim. I want to share workplace experience is really interesting. My first two jobs were working in a jail for kids and then a orthopedic handicapped hospital school in Chicago. I ran the residential part, the child care department. I had 50 full-time and 25 part-time staff working with me, and most were, all but about 7 or 8 were black. It was a real challenge crossing racial barriers, I hired a consultant to come in to do some in-service training for me. And after he did his needs assessment, he came back and said, Jim, I can't provide the training you want. Your staff don't need training. The issue in this organization is racism, because it was an all-black childcare, housekeeping, dietary staff, and all white professional staff. So we went back to the superintendent and changed the whole consultation and did a whole transformational piece within that agency. But that was really my beginning piece. My last job at Booz Allen Hamilton was a high-powered consulting job with a very diverse staff. And it was, I mean, I learned over the years, it was really quite a joy to work with people of all sorts of differences, and where we were equal at the table. You know, it was, yeah, I'll stop there. There's a lot of stories I could tell.
Well, Ted, I appreciate your questions. I feel like we could go on and on and on and on. And maybe we need to continue this discussion on another Sunday sometime. And I appreciate those of you that were able to speak up with your honesty and your truth. And again, thank you so much, Ted. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you.
At this point, we will go into our closing hymn, Let Justice Roll Down.
Morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. And I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
There is no freedom, the wise man said, let justice roll down, when the poor cry out for shelter and bread. Let justice roll down like a mighty stream. Oh, children, don't you get weary? Walk together, believe in the dream. When the way gets rough, we'll make a new way. Let justice roll down like a mighty stream. Hatred will never drive out hate. Let love roll down, roll down. Remember, our hearts can make us great. Let love roll down like a mighty stream. Oh, children, don't you get weary? Walk together, believe in the dream. When the way gets rough, we'll make a new way. And let your love roll down like a mighty stream. When brutality threatens our daughters and sons, let peace roll down, roll down. May our voices rise up louder than the guns. Let peace roll down like a mighty stream. Oh, children, don't you get weary? Walk together, believe in the dream. When the way gets rough, we'll make a new way. And let peace roll down like a mighty stream. Step by step, one by one, let justice roll down, roll down. They can kill the prophet, but the dream lives on. Let justice roll down like a mighty stream. Oh, children, don't you get weary? Walk together, believe in the dream. When the way gets rough, we'll make a
felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Our closing words today are called Loving the Ark, slightly edited by Elizabeth Nguyen. God, who is with us in the courtrooms, at the border, in the streets, in the struggle. We do not know if this arc bends toward justice. The great test of our Unitarian Universalist faith is not whether we believe we can bend the arc, but how we are when the bending looks oh so different from what we expected. Our faith teaches us two truths: that we are always enough, that the great circle of love casts no one out, and that we're responsible for bending our small piece of the arc, for finding our own racial justice front lines. When we find our front lines, we find not only our hope, but we also find our most effective action. May it be so.